In upstate New York, a man is incinerated in his own bed. With no plausible explanation, investigators are left with a terrifying question. Can we spontaneously combust?
When someone is cremated, there's probably more remains after that cremation than there was at this incident.
You know, fire is a wonderful thing. We've harnessed its power in so many ways we'd be lost without it. It does everything from keeping us warm to one of my favorites, cooking up a storm. Well, that's, if you can get started, of course. The thing about fire is, as well as being our friend, it can be our worst enemy. Does anyone smell anything that, In 1986, college student Ray Harlan was visiting his father, Jack, a coroner in New York State, when the phone rang. It would lead them on the most mysterious and bizarre journey of their lives.
My dad owns a local funeral home, and he was also the county coroner. They just said that there was an unattended death, and one of us always went with them to help them with removals.
The deceased is a 58-year-old retired fireman, George Mott. When Ray and Jack arrive at Mott's house, everything seems normal.
It was just a typical home in the back roads of the Adirondacks.
But nothing has prepared the Harlans for what they find inside.
The first words out of the state trooper's mouth to my dad was, I don't think you're going to need your stretcher for this one.
Entering the house, Ray and Jack notice something that tells them this is no ordinary death.
There was a thin black film covering everything. It was like a dust powder. It was strange because it looked like there was a fire, but there was nothing really charred.
Where is George Mott? As they move deeper into the house, they're about to make a shocking discovery.
When we walked into the bedroom, we could see where Mr. Mott was laying. In my lifetime growing up in the funeral home, I've probably seen over 1,000 bodies in various conditions. I've been to fires before, too, and nothing like that. There was a perfect outline of his body burned into the mattress. And the only thing that was left of him was his head, a few ribs, and his right foot. Everything else was gone.
What happened to George Mott? The charred remains suggest he died in a fire, but this was no ordinary blaze.
Usually in a fire, instead the whole body remains, you never see parts of the body missing. To put it in perspective, when someone is cremated for 5 to 6, sometimes 7 hours, there's probably more remains after that cremation than there was at this incident.
It's a baffling and gruesome mystery. George Mott has been incinerated to a fine powder, but somehow the objects around him are not even singed, including a canister of matches only inches away. But how? Remarkably, all over Mott's house, there is evidence that this was a fire unlike any other.
Everything plastic was melted. The casing on the TV was distorted, and the telephone was melted to a ball plastic.
It's an incredible puzzle. What sort of heat or fire could vaporize a man and melt plastic but not burn the house down?
The fireman thought it was a gas leak underneath his bed, but if it was a gas leak and it was fire, there would have been a lot more burning. They'd never found a gas leak.
It's left to Ray to offer a theory.
I mentioned human spontaneous combustion, and everybody looked at me like I was crazy.
Spontaneous human combustion, or SHC, is a bizarre and weird phenomenon in which a person instantly bursts into flames for no apparent reason. Amazingly, there have been 40 other cases of SHC documented in the last century.
To that point, I don't think anybody in that room has heard of it. And everybody almost had the same reaction. Spontaneous combustion, what is that?
You know, this is weird or what? I mean, we know heavy metal rock drummers spontaneously combust all the time. But an innocent, harmless man minding his own business in bed, and then, poof, he goes up in smoke. I mean, what's going on here? Are any of us safe? Oh no, not again! Larry Arnold is a writer. He's dedicated himself to the study of SHC. He came to the scene of the George Mott conflagration.
To be at the scene of one of these remarkably rare and phenomenal events is eerie. It's unearthly. We look at the person who used to be there, and we're looking at something burned more completely than after several hours at several thousand degrees Fahrenheit. Something burned up Mr. Mott more completely than can be accomplished in a crematorium. His body burned through his bed, actually pushed the mattress springs into a V, burned through the boarding underneath the mattress, burned through the floorboards, and into a crawl space below. There is no heat or flame damage directly above the point of combustion that consumed Mr. Mott. We could touch the ceiling. It was about 7.5 feet high. Not a scorch mark of any kind on the ceiling, directly above the point of combustion. In most fires, heat rises. We would expect to see a lot of heat and flame damage above the bed. Zero.
But if Mott self-immolated, how did it happen? Arnold believes the answer can be found in something so tiny, we can't even see it.
We wondered how much energy it takes to cremate someone like George Mott in the natural conditions, and if there could be a particle that would have that amount of energy contained within it. So we pulled up a theory from quantum physics, crunched the numbers. You come up with a particle that is incredibly small, much smaller than an atom, but it has an energy level which is humongous.
Arnold calls these subatomic particles pyrotrons. He believes they may be tiny, but they pack a punch.
It's so small that it can pass through three-dimensional matter almost unimpeded, perhaps through galaxies without ever striking something.
But according to Arnold, when the pyrotron does connect with something physical, the results are catastrophic.
On rare occasion, luck runs out, happenstance happens, and in those conditions, when the pyrotron, with its incredibly high energy, impacts something inside a human being, we posit the end result is spontaneous human combustion. In essence, a human Hiroshima effect, a thermonuclear explosion, if you will, in the body.
Is spontaneous human combustion the result of a pyrotron colliding with a particle inside the human body? Did George Mott die from a freak collision of physics? Joe Nickel is an investigator of the paranormal and a firm believer that spontaneous human combustion is a myth with a rational explanation.
I looked at 30 historical cases from the 18th century throughout the 20th century. And in every case, I could find a plausible source for the ignition. The most logical explanation for the George Mott fire was a canister of matches sitting on, of all places, his oxygen enricher unit. He had either been somewhere to light a stove or something, and a spark could have gotten onto his clothes.
But how could a spark or a cigarette burn a human body to the extent seen in SHC cases?
In the forensic literature is something known as the wick effect. And that is, if you think of a wick in a candle, the wick is not doing much burning. The wick is simply a conduit. Now, if you think of the human body as sort of a candle inside out, the body has a lot of fat. It's very flammable.
Sounds horrific. How can someone become a human candle?
The clothing acts as a kind of wick in which once the body begins to burn, that body fat can be absorbed by clothing, mattress, and that begins this cyclical process in which the body burns, releasing more body fat to destroy still more of the body, to release more. It's the wick effect that's helping this burn in a very efficient way. There's never a big fire when the body burns in this way. It's not a huge inferno. The results afterwards may look like that's what happened. But what actually happened is just that the body burned very slowly and very efficiently where the body fat was, in the torso, the upper thighs. You'll often find limbs or body parts that are not burned for pretty obvious reasons. They don't have as much body fat. Even in the torso, the upper thighs. You'll often find limbs or body parts that are not burned for pretty obvious reasons. They don't have as much body fat. Even a lean person has a significant amount of body fat. So while this isn't an explanation for all burning deaths, it's a relevant factor in some of the unusual cases because it can explain why, over a period of several hours, a fire is progressing and attacking and burning a body which is actually supplying the fuel for its own destruction.
Nickel believes that his theory can explain the almost complete lack of fire damage around the body.
Since there's never a big fire here, nearby objects are not going to be burned. Just as you can sit just inches away from a campfire and toast a marshmallow and not be burned, the same is true with this wick effect.
But does this explain the other objects that were melted throughout George's house?
The heat, of course, is gathering and rising. Objects above a certain line will be melted because the heat is accumulated there. And in the Mott case, there was soot all over. There's usually a sooty deposit if there's a lot of organic material being burned.
For Nickel, the answer is clear.
If science knows anything about spontaneous human combustion, it is that it doesn't exist. The George Mott case was a mystery. I would consider it basically a mystery solved.
Does Nickel's theory prove that SHC does not exist? Can these horrific deaths be explained by the wick effect?
We've tried to conduct those experiments ourselves. We know others in the forensics field who have done so. They can't replicate these fire scenes under controlled scientific conditions. It doesn't work for us, and it did not work for the local investigators in Essex County.
So is spontaneous human combustion real? It's a debate that will continue to rage. One thing we do know for certain, though, it's definitely weird. Or what?